Italian Pie is proud to support WYES and this episode of Wall Street Wrap-Up, and to promote the importance of financial literacy and education.
This week on Wall Street Wrap-Up, women's LSU national champions were given a parade through the LSU campus today, and will be honored at the White House, and now without their challengers of Iowa coming as first suggested by the First Lady. Your energy bills probably will be going up. Saudi Arabia said they'll be cutting oil exports to the U.S. starting in May. But please wait until after the show before filling up your tank. And Costco released their monthly sales, and they've gone down. First time in 3 years. Well, what's going on? And will this be a trend? I'm André Laborde. We've got these stories and more because it's Friday, and that's time for Wall Street Wrap-Up. Hi, I'm André Laborde. Welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up. It's Friday, April the 7th. Well, it was a shortened trading week because the markets were closed due to Good Friday today and Passover beginning yesterday. In just a minute, we'll be talking with entertainment editor for Bloomberg, Felix Gillette, and the TV and media editor for the New York Times, John Koblin. They wrote a fascinating book on streaming, cord cutting, and how HBO was born from an idea to the powerhouse it is today. It's called It's Not TV, The Spectacular Rise and Future of HBO. That's New York Times' John Koblin and Bloomberg's Felix Gillette in just a moment. Well, this week, the Dow Jones closed today at 33,485. In fact, the Dow Jones closed up, and both the NASDAQ and the S&P 500 were both closing down. Costco came out with their earnings and had the weakest monthly sales growth in 3 years. They're still growing, but not at the rate they were. Possibly because the rate of super spending post-pandemic is shifting. Costco said members made smaller purchases in March, and the average purchase of a Costco member is down 5.8% from February. Last week, we had Barron's editor Andrew Barry on as our guest, and he talked about the continued dividend yield of Altria, formerly Philip Morris. Now take a look at the major stocks that hiked their dividends last quarter. Diamondback Energy was hiked over 26%. Oracle hiked their dividend last quarter 25%. Hess Oil was over 16.5%, and American Express, they were up over 15.3%. So let's get to our guest tonight. John Koblin is the TV media editor at New York Times. Felix Gillette is the entertainment editor at Bloomberg's. Felix and John, welcome to Wall Street Wrap-Up.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Well, exactly what your titles are, I'm not sure, but I will say this, I thoroughly enjoyed your book. Okay.
Thank you so much.
What made you decide writing a book about HBO?
Yeah, I would say part of it was twofold. One was that when we started the project in 2019, I've been writing about media and entertainment in New York City for a long time. So I'd watched HBO have this incredible impact on the broader culture. And part of it was just curiosity. I wanted to go back and tell the story and learn more about its history and how it happens. And then the other part of it was just spinning the story forward. There was a lot of uncertainty when we started the book, what was going to happen to HBO. HBO's parent company, Time Warner, had just been acquired by AT&T. It was very uncertain how that acquisition was going to work. And also, HBO was in the middle of this great transformation that was taking place in the entertainment world from the era of cable and satellite television to the era of streaming. And so it was very intriguing. We thought there'd be a lot of drama as HBO tried to make that transition.
When HBO first started, the three major networks, NBC, CBS, ABC, they were the dominant players. Now today, would it be right to say that they're right now not the dominant ones, but it's now cable, and would it even be more proper to say streaming and cord cutting?
Yes, completely. I mean, sort of putting television over the internet, that has been ascendant for the last 7, 8, 9 years. And as that has happened, the ratings for the broadcast networks, the big three broadcast networks, have gone really downhill. And that also includes the cable networks as well, to the point where there are plenty of cable networks that were making original content a few years ago, like TBS and TNT, and they're not really going to be doing it going forward. So all the media world, all the investment is going into the streaming products at this point.
How do you tell? I mean, I knew that when it came to the networks, there were the Nielsen's, and you had the overnight Nielsen's that would come out, and then you'd have later on a more accurate portrayal of who watched what show at what time. When it comes to a pay prescription channel like HBO or Showtime or such, is it the Nielsen's, or how can you tell?
It is Nielsen for the premium cable networks, even though they require Nielsen is the one that measures them. But now that we're in streaming, we're in Wild West. Nielsen can measure some stuff. They can measure in the United States. They can measure if you're watching off your TV screen. But if you are streaming to, say, your laptop or your telephone, that's not going to count. And they can't count international either. They don't know who's watching in the UK. They don't know who's watching in Germany. So this has been a frustration for many producers because they want to know how many people are watching their shows.
Well, when it comes to producers, I'm assuming also directors and maybe even actors, those in front of the camera, when you work for network, you had the larger audience, but you had more notes and more restrictions because it's commercial. Now, when you're talking about a subscription model like an HBO, is it more advantageous to work for a company that has less oversight like HBO, but also you have less restrictions?
Yeah, I think that the fact that HBO didn't have advertisements was hugely important to the network's evolution. And there was this really fascinating period of time in the network's history in the mid 90s where HBO, initially when it started, it was the home box office, right? So it was,
Hmm.
the initial programming model was we're going to put on things that previously we would have had to leave your house and get a ticket to watch. So like boxing, sports, a comedy performance, a musical concert, a Hollywood movie, and they kind of, in the early years, really steered away from doing, TV series because that's what the broadcast networks did, and that's what they did so well. And there was this fascinating, moment in the mid '90s where HBO said, you know what, we're going to get into serialized television, but we're going to do it differently than the broadcast networks. And what can we offer show creators, producers that they can't get from the networks? The networks can pay them more money. They'll get more money in syndication. They'll have a bigger audience. So what can we offer them? And I think the formula that HBO eventually hit on was, we don't have advertisers. We can give you much more freedom than you'd have at the network. You're not going to have these endless notes from executives. You're not going to have these commercial sponsors looking over your shoulder, breathing down your neck. And we're going to let you do all the things on HBO that you could never do on ad-supported commercial television. And that turned into a very, very, very powerful formula. And once they went with that, you got this incredible string of programming starting in the mid 90s with, Oz, Sex and the City, Sopranos, 6 Feet Under, and HBO really went on this incredible run.
Do you think, and I think I'm pronouncing his name right, and when we're on television, I really want to be sure, Michael Fuchs, and
Mm-hmm.
who was and I'm pronouncing his last name right?
You are, yep.
He was against doing series television. Michael Fuchs, by the way, was the CEO at the time of HBO in the earlier days, but he was definitely against series television for the pay subscription. Was this the reason why? Because he didn't want to get locked in, and he thought that maybe boxing events and other type comedy events and such were cheaper and easier to put on?
Yeah, I mean, when HBO started, it was a very novel concept. You have to pay us money to watch our network. We had been used to, for decades, either listening to the radio for stories or watching television for stories. It was always free. So Michael Fuchs, in those early days, in the 70s, in the 80s, and in the early 90s, HBO was trying to do everything to differentiate itself from the broadcast networks. And when Michael Fuchs looked at what they did, he said, they do episodic television really, really, really well. But by the time Michael Fuchs was fired from the company in 19, the new CEO said, We're going to need more than that one-off comedy special. We're going to need more than that one-off made-for-TV movie. We need to keep people subscribed week to week to week, and the easiest way to do that is with episodic television.
And unlike, I guess, a gym membership where you're locked in for the year, you can subscribe to a paid television, whether HBO or others, Showtime, but you could also quit it right after your favorite TV show is finished or your special that you really wanted to watch. So this is why, John and also Felix, this is why they wanted to keep you there. They wanted to keep that hook in.
There's a great concept that one of the important figures in HBO's history, Richard Plepler, who started off doing communications at the network and eventually became head of programming and eventually the CEO of HBO, he had this great concept called the permanent campaign. And the idea of the permanent campaign was for HBO, unlike broadcast networks, HBO, he used to say, had to be elected every month. And he came from the world of politics, and he thought of HBO in some ways as a campaign. And you had to win that viewer over every time they got that cable bill at the end of the month. Like, are you going to pay that extra money for HBO? And if you are, you have to convince them. So there was no off season, there were no off days for HBO. And it was a constant struggle throughout the network's history to try and keep that customer churn at a low rate as possible.
During the early days of HBO, they found that advertisers for commercial television were aimed towards women. And the age of the demographics would be like 18 to 35 because females bought for the home, and also when you're 18 to 35, you still really haven't gotten into a brand that you really like. But when it comes to paying the bills and also who holds the remote, the man was the one usually at the house, held the remote, and also pay the bills. So with subscription, they wanted to, subscription television, say HBO, they wanted to do it more edgier, more programming that would be appealing more toward a man. Is that the way it, first off, do I have it right? Was that the way it was before? And is that still the way it is now?
It's exactly what happened in HBO's early days. And again, that's part of Michael Fuchs. How can we differentiate ourselves in the broadcast networks? Well, if the broadcast networks are programming for women, we're going to program for men. So then you have sports like boxing. You have a lot of nudity on the network, mostly female nudity. And this really influenced HBO's programming decisions for decades. I mean, there is a Sex and the City in 1998 with 4 female leads, but that was really an outlier for years and years and years. In fact, as recently as 2016, 57% of HBO's audience were men, only 43% were women. But HBO has made a concerted effort in the last 6-7 years, as the streaming really taken off. Let's make more programs with women in the lead, tailored toward women. And as of last year, it's a 50-50 breakdown between men and women in terms of the number of viewers or the breakdown of viewers for HBO.
When we would talk about notes, and for the sort of like a little inside baseball, when in commercial television, many times the executives of a network would send notes to the production, to the director as such, we want this, or we don't want that, or this may upset a commercial advertiser and such. And with HBO, it's very few notes. But one of the notes that I found that you had in your book, that when they wanted more cable edge. What's cable edge?
Yeah. That's Cable Edge was a code word inside of HBO, basically for more female nudity. So HBO in the early 90s was making these things they called adult sitcoms. And often the writers on those shows would get that note back, say, yeah, the script looks pretty good, but it needs a lot more cable edge. And again, that's what fits in with that programming philosophy where they were kind of pandering to male viewers at that point. And it's interesting too because a lot of their early efforts in serialized shows back in the 80s, they would occasionally dip their toe in it. And, they realized they had to do things differently than the broadcast networks. And the most obvious thing they could do was nudity and, bad language. But it turns out that just nudity and bad language actually doesn't make very good television. So it was, those early shows, some of them were really terrible. And it took them to the point, of a decade of kind of experimenting with different things before they realized, oh, what we really need are, seasoned TV creators, people that have spent their careers successfully working in broadcast television, have kind of mastered those rules of broadcast television, and then they can come to HBO and break all of those rules and do things that they could never do on a broadcast ad-supported show. Things like killing off the main character in the first episode, and setting show. One of their first big dramas that they really invested in was Oz, which was set in a prison. And broadcast television, historically had really not done prison shows because it was too dark, it was too violent, it was not the kind of thing people would want to spend their Friday nights or Saturday night watching. So once HBO learned to do it differently than broadcast television, things really took off.
Well, I would assume from its inception of HBO to what it is today, the cost of production of content has risen dramatically. Is the money we're talking about that HBO receives, is it only coming from subscription? Because as we talk about network, you get money from advertising. So you could always raise the advertising. And of course, I admit, yes, you raise the cost of subscriptions. But is that where they're getting their money to being able to buy the content?
Yeah, that's the core constituency. This is why that subscriber count matters so much to HBO, as well as all of HBO's competitors, especially in streaming. It's funny, if we're talking about HBO sort of pioneered paying for a television network, here we are 5 decades after it was born, and now every media company, they are obsessed with something called churn, making sure that they don't lose subscribers, or if they do, how do we replace those subscribers? So there are other sales. HBO benefited greatly in the early 2000s from DVD sales, but subscription counts and the amount of money you're earning from each subscriber is really, really significant to HBO and to all of its competitors.
Netflix now, which is a major competitor, Netflix has started their regular subscription, but they've also got an ad portion that if you wanted to pay a less amount, you would have advertisement. Do you think HBO and other like Showtime, Cinemax and such would go this route as well?
Yes, they've actually gone that route. Since last year, HBO Max, HBO's streaming service, they've had an ad tier just like Netflix. Disney, Disney Plus, they didn't do ads initially. They just introduced it last month. So yeah, the ad tier is becoming very popular because in the US market especially, Netflix is sort of topped out at around 70, 75 million subscriptions in the US. And that appears to be kind of the high watermark. So if there are a lot more than 70, 75 million people in this country, how do we appeal to them? Introduce a cheaper ad tier, and maybe then they'll be interested. Maybe then they will become subscribers. And all of a sudden, we got out of the world of the TV bundle, the cable bundle, where we were all spending $100, $150, sometimes more on cable every month. And now we have this a la carte streaming world. Many people have cut the cord, but these streaming services are becoming more and more and more expensive. So maybe for an HBO Max, you want the premium. Maybe for a Netflix, you want premium. But then you look at Paramount Plus, or you look at Peacock, and you say, you know what? I'll take the ad tiers here.
Now, was what we had talked about before, when you're going to cord cutting and going to streaming, can the ratings be found of how good they're doing or not doing from when they're getting out of the bundle but going into the streaming?
The ratings, it's interesting that when this transition happened and everything was moving towards streaming, Netflix kind of led the way of really not sharing the viewership data with outsiders. They kept it to themselves. They didn't share it with reporters, and they didn't share it with the show creators also. I mean, it gave them some leverage in terms of knowing what was working and what wasn't. And, they didn't have advertisers, for the first decade of streaming, there were no advertisers. And, so you didn't have to report how many viewers were watching at any point. Now I think as as John was talking about, we're moving into this world where advertisers are really coming into the streaming ecosystem in a big way. Part of the change you're going to see is that Netflix, HBO Max, all these streaming services, if they're going to sell you a lower priced, ad supported uh, programming tier, then they're going to have to measure those audiences much more carefully, and they're going to have to share that audience measurement with those advertisers. And as that happens, there's reporters like me and John roaming around trying to get that information, and there's a lot more ways to get it if they're handing it out to the sponsors.
What was surprising to me was that HBO always let the cable companies, the local cable companies, whether it be Comcast, Cox Cable, whatever it may be, they were always the link between the subscriber and HBO. And then when AOL bought Time Warner, it was like David taking over Goliath. They just, I'm assuming, assumed, well, HBO's got all these lists of subscribers. Now we could integrate that into our other areas of AOL and such. What happened?
Huge miscalculation by AOL, which in retrospect looks almost comical that they didn't know this ahead of time. But we do have a funny scene in the book where, these AOL managers fly in for one of their first meetings with HBO executives after this acquisition took place in 2000. And AOL had kind of sold this huge mega deal, which at that point was the biggest corporate merger and acquisition in the history of American business. They'd sold it to Wall Street. They'd sold it to the public on this idea of synergy. We're going to kind of take the data that we have on the internet. We're going to take the programming that this traditional media company has. We're going to combine those two, and it's going to unleash all of these opportunities for new creative paths, new business opportunities. And, there was this comical moment where the merger had finally gone through, and they show up and they're meeting with the HBO executives, and they say, okay, let's get started. First, we want to know, give us all your data and your customers. And there was kind of like this awkward silence. And the executives at HBO were like, I hate to tell you this, but we don't really actually have any of that information for you, because you're right. They were always a wholesaler. They always, the way the model worked is the cable distributors around the country had the relationship with the customer and not HBO. And it was kind of a colossal mistake.
Netflix was just an upstart. In fact, they were doing battle with a company many years ago called Blockbuster. And there was a thought at HBO, look, it's very small. We can offer them $2 billion, which was basically chump change at the time, and for doing it. But what happened when they broached the idea of buying Netflix?
Yeah, there was this amazing moment in 2005, 2006, where there was a group of HBO executives on the West Coast that were working on business development, and they were looking at Netflix. And this was the era where Netflix's primary business was sending out DVDs by mail. And you would go to their website, and you would look through all these titles and choose a couple. They'd send them out by the mail. And it was a really popular service. And HBO executives were looking at this, and they said, you know what? We should go out and buy this little upstart, and we combine Netflix with HBO. We would control another window, another way of reaching customers. We wouldn't have to go through the cable networks. We'd start to establish a direct to consumer relationship for the first time. This would be a nice thing to have in our portfolio. So they drew up a proposal and they put it together. It's a nice, 35-page slide deck. And they went to New York and they took it to their bosses and they sat down. They said, here, we have this great idea that, Time Warner has funds for, acquiring startups. And we have the, great idea that would be perfect for us. Let's go out and buy Netflix. And they started the presentation. Before they even got through it, their bosses said, nope, no way. We're not interested. This whole Netflix thing is a flash in the pan. It's going to go away. It's not for us. And they cut them off very quickly.
Thanks to Felix Gillette of Bloomberg and John Koblin of the New York Times. Well, if you've got a question or a comment about the show, make it concise, make it pithy, and write us and notice the new email address at andre@benacapital.com. So let's look ahead at the markets heading into next week. But first, on April 5th, what trillion-dollar company was founded in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1975 and went public in 1986? We'll have the answer in just a moment. On April 5th, what trillion-dollar company was founded in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 1975 and went public in 1986? Microsoft. Now, most people think it was a Seattle company, but actually, the founding was in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Now, 3 years after they were founded, sales reached about $1 million, and Microsoft went public in 1986 at $26 a share. Well, since then, it has risen, and hold on to your seats, a whopping 390,000%. In fact, a $1,000 investment in 1986 at the IPO would now be worth over $4 million. That's called a return on investment. Let's have a wrap up on Wall Street. The ratings are in for March Madness and the NCAA championships. The men's game was broadcast on CBS, and they brought in 11.2 million viewers. While the women's championship game, where LSU brought in the national championships, they brought in a record 9.9 million viewers on ESPN. And congratulations to the women's LSU champs. Well, move over, Elon Musk. According to Forbes magazine, who is the richest person in the land? The CEO of Tesla has now been moved to the number 2 slot. That number 1 pole position is now held by Bernard Arnault, the head of luxury company LVMH, which sells Louis Vuitton and other luxury goods. Musk is worth an estimated $180 billion, down $40 billion from last year. Now, where Arnault is now worth an estimated $211 billion. That's give or take $1 billion. And that's a wrap-up on Wall Street Wrap-Up. The National Small Business Association poll found that many small businesses are finding it difficult in securing loans for their businesses with the tightening of credit in small and regional banks. The poll found over half of small businesses are not able to secure adequate financing since the bank failures of SVB and Signature banks. And bank earnings next week will be coming out for the first quarter of Wells Fargo and JP Morgan. Now they will be released. So great timing. My guest next week will be the former deputy chairman of the FDIC and banking and financial consultant, John Bovenzi. John also took over as CEO of IndyMac after the FDIC took over that bank failure. So he's knowledgeable about bank failures and bank liquidity. That's next week, former deputy chairman of the FDIC, John Bovenzi. And that's our show for this Friday, April the 7th. My thanks to Felix and John for joining us, but always we want to thank you for allowing us into your homes tonight. Have a fun weekend with the ones you love and a productive week ahead. I'll be here next week. Remember, if it's Friday, it is Wall Street Wrap-Up. I'm André Laborde. And remember, money never sleeps. Good night.
Italian Pie is proud to support WYES and this episode of Wall Street Wrap-Up, and to promote the importance of financial literacy and education.